it's really exciting to have this panel today and some wonderful panelists who I'm going to introduce in just a minute. I want to start by just talking a little bit about the context here. What's happened to prison funding in the state of California. Roughly speaking, in the 1980s, prison funding was about 4% of the general fund budget, something like that. By the way, funding for the University of California at that time was about 5% of the general fund budget. So more funding for the UC, the University of California alone, than for prisons. Today, funding for prisons is something around, depending on what exact things you put in there, around 12%. So it's grown 3 times. Funding, by the way, for the University of California is about 2.6% of the general fund budget. So it's literally been halved. So needless to say, this is a topic that people in academia are focused on. It's even led to my modest proposal that we turn the University of California into a prison, especially here at Berkeley. Then we could unionize and have the California Correctional Peace Officers Association help us organize our faculty to perhaps increase our salaries. And also, by the way, it may be really a good thing with respect to graduate students who want to stay here at Berkeley forever. All they would have to do is to commit 3 crimes, 3 felonies, hopefully not too serious, and then we would keep them forever. And so a lot of people might be happy. And oh, by the way, prisoners, it's about $49,000 per prisoner right now in terms of costs. We're getting something like $12,000 or $13,000 per student. So that would increase the amount of money we have per student. I'm sure we could do a better job of that kind of money. So there's one modest proposal, but we're actually going to go to something a little bit more maybe possible today as we talk about various options. Prison spending in California has, as those statistics show you, grown substantially in the last 20 or 30 years. We have not received, many people think, the best outcomes from this investment. There's high recidivism in California. There's substantial litigation with respect to the prisons. The rise in spending is driven by increased population and the increased costs, the increased population, not just in the state, but the increased population of inmates in the prisons, which has gone up very substantially, and the increased costs of incarceration per prisoner. So those kinds of trends make you wonder about, is this sustainable? Can we keep going on this way? Are we getting the best amount of value for our funding? What's actually very interesting too is, well, when prison funding has gone up substantially, funding for police in local areas has not gone up at the same rate. So you might want to ask the question about sort of the trade-off between having local police who prevent crime and maybe deter crime versus having a system that puts people in prison after crimes are committed and costs us a lot of money doing that. So that's another kind of trade-off you might want to think about. There are 4 general strategies for reducing costs: reducing the number of people sent to prison, reducing the amount of time individuals spend in prison. These are pretty straightforward. Reducing the cost per person of incarcerating people, or reducing parole caseloads and returns to prison. And I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about parole in this state, because that's a very big issue. We have a lot of people returning to prison because of parole violations, an exceptionally high number, something like 2/3 return, as I understand it, for those kinds of reasons. So we're going to talk about 3 particular policy alternatives. But to begin with, we're going to have an introductory statement by the Legislative Analyst's office, which will sort of set the stage for where we are. And then we're going to go to the panel. Let me introduce the entire panel right now so that we will have that out of the way, and then we can go forward with the Legislative Analyst. First, furthest away from me is Dave Lewis with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, which is a new word added to the title, I think in 2006, if I've got it right. 2005. Which, at least in terms of language, suggests more emphasis upon rehabilitation. It's not clear that much of that has really happened. Lance Corcoran, who is from the California Correctional Peace Officers Association, and we'll talk about their important role in prisons in the state of California and in the politics of prisons in the state of California. John Dannenberg, who's a contributing writer on Prison Legal News, and a former prisoner in the California prison system, and we'll talk about issues from the inside. Then our two LAO experts, both MPPs I might mention, one from the University of California, Berkeley. I won't tell you which because it might decrease the credibility of the one who isn't from Berkeley. The one from Duke. But we're pleased that they're both MPPs, showing that Mr. Reed does, by the way, get you a job. And we have two people here from the office. We have Aaron Edwards, and we have Paul Golaszewski from the LAO. And I don't know how you're splitting it up. Who's going first? And you have something like 10 minutes.
Well, I'll start off. I'm Paul Golaszewski with the Legislative Analysts Office. For those of you who, I'm not sure if you're familiar with our office, we're a part of the legislature. We serve the entire legislature, both parties, Republicans and Democrats, and both houses, the Senate and the Assembly. And primarily what we do is we provide the legislature with advice on the state budget. Our office does a number of other things. We prepare the analysis of all of the initiatives that appear on the ballot and so forth. But our major responsibility regards the state budget. And so because CDCR is such a large state department, we have two analysts who are assigned, Aaron and myself. And the way that we've split up the assignment is I handle most of CDCR administration, sentencing law changes, parole and board of parole hearings, and Aaron will talk a little bit about the areas that he covers. In terms of the LAO's approach to CDCR's budget, sort of our basic philosophy, especially in times of fiscal shortfalls like right now, we generally think that it makes sense to prioritize limited resources on the most serious and the most violent offenders. So that's sort of basically how we approach it. And then we've had a number of different policy recommendations and options for the legislature to achieve that. And I won't go into great detail about all of them, but you know, in the past we've recommended changing certain sentencing laws for crimes that currently can be punished with state prison or county jail, so that they would only be punishable by county jail, thereby shifting sort of the least serious offenders down to the county level, and reserving expensive prison beds for the more serious offenders. We've also proposed different policy options for parole. So for instance, providing what's called an earned discharge program for parolees. Previously, until some recent changes in the legislature, every parolee was put on parole for 3 years. And our idea was to allow parolees with good behavior to be let off parole after, say, 6 months. Again, concentrating resources against on the more serious parolees. Another idea that our office has that actually was implemented last year was to provide incentive funding to county probation departments to do a better job managing county probationers, a lot of whom end up being revoked on probation and coming to state prison, which is very expensive. So basically under the new program that the legislature implemented, the state is now giving counties basically incentive funding and saying if you can reduce the number of probationers that are being revoked to state prison, we'll reward you with funding that you can invest in different programs and practices. So those are just a couple of the ideas that we've had in the past, and I'll let Aaron talk about the areas that he works on.
Thanks, Paul. And I am the GSPP graduate, I confess. And it's true that the toolbox you get here is going to get you a job someday. I know that sometimes you guys probably get sick of hearing about the toolbox, but it's great. It really helps out. I talked about it all the time in my interviews. So I cover correctional health care and also rehabilitation programming in prison. And I'm going to talk a little bit first about correctional health care. It is the fastest growing major portion of the Department of Corrections budget. And that's mainly because basically every aspect of what we do in the area of healthcare is guided, or basically the courts are telling us what we can and can't do, because we've done such a poor job as a state in delivering correctional health care for so many years. that the states have taken over. In the case of medical care, they've actually taken over responsibility for the delivery of that care. And in the case of mental health and dental, they're very closely monitoring what we're doing in that area. So to give you an idea of what that means in terms of how much we're actually spending, we spend about $16,000 a year per inmate on health care. And to put that in context, most states are spending about $3,000 to $7,000 a year. So even, looking at the most expensive other states, we're still on the order about twice of what they're spending. So it's quite a bit. So the major things that are happening in this area right now, the governor is proposing to reduce the medical care budget next year by about $800 million, which is roughly a 40% reduction in spending on medical care. So it's a very significant reduction. And I think we do support the idea of delivering these services more efficiently. Our office has been on record supporting things like telemedicine, for example, which utilizes technologies to reduce medical care costs. Right now, we're not sure if this is really a realistic cut, though. This $800 million, there's not a really detailed plan on how to achieve it, so we're not sure whether that's going to actually materialize or not. The governor also is proposing to have the UC provide correctional health care. So basically, we would be contracting all of the correctional health care out to the University of California. And I won't get too much into that because I think I saw it on the agenda, something we're going to discuss later. But I'd be happy to comment on that later. I also cover rehabilitation programming, and in that area, there's been substantial cuts. 2008-09, we spent about $550 million on rehabilitation programming. This is stuff like vocational training for inmates, academic programs, and substance abuse treatment. Last year, the legislature passed a $250 million reduction to these type of programs. And about $200 million of that came from the in-prison programs. So that's a huge, huge cut. It's roughly a third of their budget. So because of that, there's been major changes in how we deliver these programs, and also in the number of programs. The number of inmates who can participate in these programs is very limited now. On that note, I guess, on that bad news note, I guess that summarizes my introductory points, and look forward to discussing these specific proposals.
Why don't we just go across the panel? John, why don't you go next?
Thank you. I'd like to address the question from the top down. Dean Brady has suggested 4 alternatives. I'd like to also offer none of the above in another way of looking at the problem. My concern, having been in the system, is that I didn't see any correction going on. And correction is the name of the department. And if you look in the state codes, you'll find that there's no definition of the word corrections. There's no definition of it. It's my thesis that you can't measure it. If you can't quantify it because it's undefined, then you can't measure it. And that gets down to the bottom line. You cannot incentivize someone to have achieved it because it cannot be measured. So I would go back to the legislature with this problem, and I think that is the core of the problem. Corrections is an institution that's legislative ordained, but it has the susceptibility to an unbounded budget because it doesn't have any limit, it has no definition. And I think Dean Brady pointed out that it's gone from 2% to 12% of the budget over the years. In addition, the term rehabilitation, which was recently added, also has no definition. So we have a Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation without a definition. We have 30,000 peace officers, correctional officers, who daily report to their jobs. They have a work statement in front of them, which is called a post order, which is set forth by management. They perform their job. But those post orders don't have anything to do with the statement, correct someone. The post orders have to do with the security that these officers provide, and they have specific duties that they regularly do. California's recidivism rate approaches 70%. I think the last number I heard was 66%. And that predictably has an unbounded drag on the public fisc. And I'm claiming that without some way of reducing recidivism as a goal, this problem will never end, and I've watched it grow. What is needed, I'm going to suggest, and this is going to go back to the legislature, they're the ones I'm pointing at, is a new program. Instead of the Department of Corrections, I would have two departments. One would be the Department of Incarceration, which would house all those persons who do not have any probability or possibility of getting out of prison. Those include people on condemned row, those doing life without parole, and those who are too old to survive their sentences. They would be housed separately and treated humanely, but they wouldn't need the cost of programming as we now know it. The other people would be in the Department of Reintegration, and I would define reintegration because I criticize the lack of a definition for corrections. I would define reintegration as simply not recidivating. So, what do we do with that? I'm suggesting that we take all of the persons that are in this Department of Reintegration and we incentivize them by taking some fraction of their salary, 10%, pick a number, and put that on a measure of actually achieving a reduction in recidivism. I would include everybody from the janitor to the director, and I would make sure that this is part and parcel of the program. These would be, the people that are working inside would be reintegration counselors. They would be people who would be trained, perhaps some of the teachers that we've had to lay off with the education budget, people who are trained to help people learn how to turn their lives around, and particularly how to manage a life without drugs. There's a revolving door that the men inside, the men and women inside of prison. We talk about recycling here in Berkeley is a great thing. The Department of Corrections has been doing it for decades, only the recycling prisoners. There's a loss of hope for the men and women inside, and if they had the resource of someone who was incentivized to help them succeed, I believe that then we would be on a positive path, both for our budget and for the people that we're trying to keep from coming back to prison. Thank you.
Lance.
I have to agree with much of what I've just heard. I started with the Department of Corrections in 1986 as a correctional officer. I had 224 men on my tier, and me. In California, we ranked 48th with respect to inmate to staff ratios. If we wanted the same staff ratio as New York, we would have to hire 25,000 correctional officers today. The reality is that our measure of success based on the 80s was not rehabilitation. It was incapacitation. It was incarceration. It was making sure that they didn't get out, and we did that very, very well. When it came to rehabilitation, here's what we did in California. We designed the medical, the dental, the food, the education, the vocation based on one inmate per cell. But we put 2 beds in every cell. So we wrote off 50% right off the top. We did not have the capacity. We did not have the facilities to make rehabilitation our measure of success. And that's changed. People don't want to spend money. People don't want to spend $49,000 a year on an inmate. They want us to be successful. And as a profession, I'm in my 24th year. I am tired of being a failure. I got involved in corrections not because of a desire to be powerful, but a desire to help people, to make a change in someone's life, to give them an opportunity. But when we're spending money teaching small engine repair to an individual who's going to parole to Oakland, there's not a lot of lawnmower shops in Oakland. We need to find what that community needs. And here's the problem. We take individuals as the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, which I think is absolute crap. All right? First of all, if we're correcting, what do we need to rehabilitate for? And actually, the wrong word is rehabilitate. That means return to their former state. How about habilitate? How about give men an opportunity, men and women, an opportunity to make positive changes in their lives? But here's what happens. You ever see this show, Intervention? You ever seen it? Okay, now we have loving families who intervene in people's lives and send them to a rehab. They send them to missions, or they send them to Better Tomorrow. They send them these different places. And if they mess up, they don't blame interventions. They don't blame the rehab. They say, you didn't work your steps. You didn't read your book. You didn't get a sponsor. You didn't do all the things that you have to do. But with the Department of Corrections, we take individuals that nobody wanted. Their families, in many cases, don't want them. Their communities certainly didn't want them. Law enforcement didn't want them. And we take them for X number of years, and we have limited resources, and we're supposed to put out better people. And we're amazed that when we put them back in communities that don't want them back, that they fail. I can't believe that we're successful 30% of the time. Because, I mean, public housing, I can tell you right now, I mean, in the apartments where I live, I have to sign a waiver. I have to sign that I have not committed certain crimes. And we're amazed that they fail. In some cases, we have individuals committing crimes coming back to the system for medical procedures, and that's wrong. Look, I don't want to be a failure. I love my profession. I love my job. And I love the men and women. I mean, we have 20% of our representation are female. They're wonderful. And we have some really great people. And you know what? I represent 34,000 people. And if just 1% of them were bad, that's 340 people. And 340 people can make us all look really, really bad. Thank you. Appreciate being here.
I've been dealing with the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and at the time CDC, for a decade, working on the budget, and I've seen it grow from about $5 billion to last fiscal year, 2008-9, well over $10 billion. And a large part of that growth is related to healthcare, as the LAO pointed out, increasing salaries for all staff over the early part of this decade before the last year, when the governor obviously cut people's salaries by the 15% for the furloughs. And people often assume that that there's a lot of bloat in corrections, and I certainly am not going to be the one to say that we're the most efficient organization on the face of the planet. But as Mr. Corcoran pointed out, our staff to inmate ratios are much lower than most other states. That we also don't have a real focus on necessarily rehabilitation of inmates, and our teaching and our programs have taken severe cuts over the last couple of years. There's, contrary to what many people might think, there's little in the way of fat in our institutions that can go in and just slice it off. Our men and women that work in our prisons work very hard. They do a good job doing what we've asked them to do, which is keep the public safe, keep the inmates from escaping, but we have done little in the way of rehabilitation, though we're trying to institute programs that we think will be more successful in addressing the criminogenic needs of our offenders, than they have been in the past. Largely in the past, our education programs, for example, were largely modeled on traditional education models with students or inmates in the seats for 6+ hours a day. And these, you have to remember, are largely people that, when they were students in public schools, were unsuccessful. And those models don't necessarily work, and we're exploring different models. And that's the way we've been able to attempt to cut a significant amount of our educational resources and still provide as much programming as we can to the inmates that we have. We've had to cut our substance abuse programs. We've had to do all of those things. And that's really the only way you can cut the per capita costs of our prisons, is by addressing those program costs, because as Mr. Corcoran pointed out, you can go in a dorm in any of our facilities. They're a dorm facility, and there'll be 100 to 200 guys on the floor and 1 to 2 COs, and that's all that you have. You're obviously not going to be removing any of those COs, and so that leaves little room for those kinds of things. We have attempted to become more efficient as a department. We've cut 600 headquarters positions over the past year, largely to become more efficient. We've cut programs. We've cut our budget from that $10.3 billion that we're talking about to an expected somewhere around $8.6 billion this year. That's very difficult, and largely that comes on the backs of our staff through the furlough program, which saves $750 million. But unfortunately, we're not able to give our correctional officers additional time off because we didn't get more staff to give them that time. So what it does is lead to accrued leave balances that we'll be paying for many years in the future. And that's kind of a deferred cost rather than a true savings at this point. All these things, I think that it's important to note that the department is driven by the inmate population. If you want to talk about how to cut costs, it has to really be around how do you reduce the inmate population, whatever the strategy that you want to use, whether it's addressing parole, whether it's addressing recidivism, whether it's addressing the front door, who comes to prison, the length of time, all of those things. The governor and the administration have proposed things to address many of those. But the reality that we face is that everything we do turns into a very political issue. We've tried to address some of the parole issues that have faced the state, and I'm sure many of you have read the newspaper articles that have been heavily critical of the department and its approach. This is not the first time the department has tried to address parole, and every single time previous it's had to bow to political pressure and back down. So those are the kinds of issues that we face as a department in trying to reduce our costs.
Thanks. Those are great opening statements, and all within time, which is wonderful. The University of California has just reduced its budget from state funding by almost 30%. You just said you cut your budget by about 17%. Why can we do it and you can't?
Well, largely because we have, once again, as Mr. Corcoran pointed out, our staff to inmate ratio is not such that you can just go and cut staff. You have to find ways to reduce the population.
Neither is ours, by the way.
Well, I understand.
For what it's worth.
And I'm not trying to in any way compare. So we're left with, and there was about $1.2 billion worth of proposed cuts in last year's budget, and the legislature failed to pass most of the policy recommendations that would have been necessary to make those types of reductions. They're very difficult for people to face up to the costs of corrections and make those kinds of decisions because of the politics of the situation. And the department has no ability and no mechanism not to accept inmates. So if we, for example, say to a county, we're not going to take an inmate, we're still paying for them, we're just paying the county for them instead of paying our own staff. And largely because we have fixed staffing ratios, we'll still be paying the staff and we'll be paying our county, and really increased our costs substantially.
Well, let's go at it another way. K through 12 in this state keeps taking, is right now very near the bottom in terms of the amount of money spent per pupil, has exceptionally high ratios of number of students per classroom to teachers. It does have relatively high-paid teachers, but there's a lot of criticism that we've got to get more efficient in that arena. That's an arena in which they can't turn students away. So it's a little like the corrections area. Why do we think that that area can and should, or at least some folks certainly think it can and should get more efficient, but we sort of say, well, that's really hard in corrections. Is there really nothing we can do? How about John's proposal, some kind of incentive, that would be a monetary incentive, the kinds of things we do in private sector businesses?
Once again, that would require some type of legislative action.
Of course. But is it a good idea?
I haven't really explored this idea that is laid out, but I'm not. I certainly think that there's lots of room for improvement and room for efficiencies in the department. And we've been approaching those. For example, many people may not know this, but our IT system that we use to track inmates was developed in the 1970s, and we can't even use it to really calculate sentences because of the age of the system and how many sentencing changes have been made. But that requires time and money to develop a new IT system and replace it. And we're playing with those kinds of issues that we're trying to address over time in order to become more efficient as a system, because we do recognize the need to become efficient. And once again, pointing to the issue that Mr. Corcoran spoke to, when our prisons were designed, they were designed to not be staff intensive. And as such, we don't have a lot of staff compared to other states.
But let me point out this. I mean, at Lancaster, they tried to establish an honor yard. An honor yard. It's a yard where you sign that you will obey certain rules and you will get certain privileges. Now, if you can think of an institution as A, B, C, and D, this was A yard. They had 800 beds on A yard. Actually, they had 1,000. 200 were administrative segregation. So they had 800 beds to fill. And they only allowed the inmates at Lancaster, 4,000, to apply for the honor yard. Now the problem with that is, instead of 134,000 people applying for 1,000 or 800 beds, you've only got now 3,200 possible. So what happens is they only fill some of the beds. So you get a bus late at night, 40 inmates. You got to put them somewhere. They're all turkeys, quite frankly. So what do? You fill the empty beds in the honor yard. So you don't have a true honor yard. If we had honor prisons, if we had an opportunity to put 4,000 people who want a program at the same facility, regardless of their level, who cares? We put level 1 through 4 females together in the same institution. We can do that with men as well. The only difference between a male institution and a female institution, quite frankly, is underwear. A man puts his dirty laundry in a bag, sends it off to the laundry, and gets back 5 different pairs of underwear. He don't care. But a lady, I'm telling you right now, they will not wear another lady's underwear. And that's the big difference. But the reality is...
I won't either, by the way.
The reality is that we can find ways that let those people who want to program exactly what you're talking about. Reintegration, rehabilitation. We can do that. I mean, when I hear about telemedicine, I went to telemedicine. 1996, I went to then director James Goldman and I said, telemedicine. You don't have to transport anybody. This is an opportunity to save money. We had Cedar-Sinai. that was signed on. And James Gomez looked at me and he said, if you think that I'm going to let inmates in California go to Cedars-Sinai, you're out of your freaking mind. And he said other words. But anyway, no, I mean, that has been the mindset. How it has been is how it is done. You know what? And that's why we're screwing up. You know why we got Madrid? You know why we got Coleman? Because the department did studies. 3 independent studies that said their mental health system was terrible. So when Madrid came along, they said,
Just know what Madrid is, just so everybody knows.
Madrid is the decision that affects medical and mental health at Pelican Bay specifically, and use of force. And so the reality was, when the Madrid decision came down, not only were they in violation of the Constitution, they were willfully in violation of the Constitution because they knew. They had 3 independent reports that said, you're messing up. And this is the frustration from the union, is that we're trying to bring this out. I mean, yeah, we make good money. I'm not going to deny it. We make good money. And I'm not going to apologize for our success. But, damn it, you know what? We also do a pretty doggone good job, for the most part, for what we've been charged with. And there's a lot of people that care out there.
Let me ask the LEO dynamic duo, because they're MPPs, so they're a dynamic duo. Exactly what you think about cost-saving measures. What can we do, and can we actually save money? Can we start reducing the cost per person of incarceration, or at least reduce the growth of that cost in some ways?
Well, what Dave's been saying, is basically true, that the staffing ratio for correctional officers is quite lean at the moment. That said, we also pay our correctional officers probably the most, if not more, than any other state. So labor costs are quite high. I don't think that you could necessarily reduce staff without reducing the inmate population. And that's the biggest chunk of CDCR's budget, second biggest chunk will be healthcare. But in terms of security, you couldn't really reduce the number of officers unless you reduce the population. And I was talking about some different policy options for that. I think there are definitely things that the department could be doing to be more efficient, but when you're looking for really big savings, and remember, the budget deficit is $20 billion, that's about 20% of the general fund. Simple administrative savings in CDCR's budget is not going to solve the problem. If you want to get really big savings, you're going to have to find some way to reduce the inmate population, save money on healthcare costs.
Let's talk about healthcare costs. We're going to go to reducing inmate population in a few minutes, but let's talk about healthcare costs. What can we do there?
Well, I think there's a lot of them there. The fastest growing area of healthcare costs is basically what we're paid to refer inmates to outside hospitals. We spent $850 million on those outside referrals just in 2008-09. And that's been growing astronomically. If we look at 2005-06, just 3 years prior, we're spending about half of that, $400 million. So we have roughly even greater than a doubling of costs over a 3-year period. And part of that is because we weren't doing what we needed to do back in 2005-06. But part of it is that I don't think we have the right technology in place. We don't have the right processes in place to determine who needs to go to a hospital for a medical appointment and who doesn't. And I think, we can reduce a lot of costs there just by implementing a utilization management system similar to what HMOs use in the outside community. That's actually happening right now, and we're seeing some cost reduction there. We're on track to reduce costs in that area by about $100 million this year. So I think that there's some promise there, and I think costs will continue to come down there because we really, I don't think, should be spending that much money. Again, with the telemedicine, it's going to be huge savings if we can implement telemedicine, much like has been done in Texas. Texas has been very successful there. And so we have a model for what this should look like. What we need to do is get the technology in place to make it happen. We've been talking about it for years, and we're not there yet.
What's telemedicine exactly? And so what does that mean? How do we save money? somebody's got to touch the patient eventually if something has to be done, presumably.
Yes, sometimes that's the case, sometimes it's not the case. Some of these appointments, basically the technology is you put a video camera in, you can bring it right up to a cell, or there's often like rooms, like a regular doctor's room, where you just bring the technology in and you can link up with doctors anywhere in the state, basically, and they can provide a lot of services just through that connection. And the real cost savings there, you don't have to escort that person out to the community. Anytime we send someone out to the community, we need 2 guards, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, watching that person. Whether they're in a vegetative state or whatever, it doesn't matter. So, I mean, we've had instances where we're paying 2 prison guards, overtime, they're spending $1,000 a day. Sorry, corrections officers. A couple $1,000 a day to watch someone who's in a coma. Some of these things are, I think there's a lot of room to cut there.
Okay. How about John's proposal for some kind of incentives being put in this system for getting things done better? Does that make sense, or is the LAO looking at those kinds of things? Have other states done those kinds of things?
One recommendation we've had in the past, specifically with employment programs for parolees, would be to structure, because a lot of that is done in contracts with agencies, so to make the funding contingent on successful job placements and stuff like that. It sounds like what he's talking about is much broader, and having it for the entire involving state employees in the prison would be a much, much bigger proposal. We haven't really looked at that. In terms of contract work, we sort of thought that makes sense in the past.
John, do you have anything more to say about that proposal?
Well, I would say that the concept of reintegration counselors would extend to paroles. And I would not have, I would have people that had a caseload who were not peace officers, who did not have an adversarial position against the person who was on parole, whose goal for the paid incentive was to help them succeed on their task, whether it's a job placement, whether it's a mentor. I've watched, over the years that I spent inside, I watched a large loss of hope. And who spent time inside, particularly those who were on what they call life sentences. A life sentence is a sentence of something to life, 7 years to life, 15 to life. And these people kept getting rejected by the politically driven parole board, which is part of the Department of Corrections. And the person never got a chance to earn, for example, the credits that he was due for good behavior, because he was constantly denied parole until all chance of credits had evaporated. And so I watched people lose hope, and they also lost contact. Their family passed away, their friends left them, and when they finally did get out, it was only because they had some person who went way over the line to help them, to be their mentor. I believe that the department would be money ahead if they had greeting someone at what we now call the parole office. They had a mentor who was there to welcome them and to be their friend whom they no longer had because they'd been down too long, and help them to survive and move forward. And when they see them starting to falter, rather than write them up and create a technical parole violation and send them back to prison, they pick them up and they help them, and they train them, and they tell them that they love them or they care for them, because a lot of people don't have that. And that's what's missing. There is a whole body of parole violations called technical paroles. That's where you're basically arrested by your parole agent for having violated some of your terms and conditions of parole. Could be not showing up on time for your meeting, could be being out of bounds, could be being in the wrong area, or being on drugs. But they're not crimes per se, they are simply violations of your parole conditions. 40,000 people in prison at any one time, approximately, are in on technical parole violations. That's approximately a quarter of the inside population. If we were to simply eliminate technical parole violations and let those 40,000 no longer go back to each year, yeah, you would have some guys going out and committing crimes, which the community could afford, but you wouldn't have as many of them returning, and you would have an immediate cut on the population. The other body of people that would be significant to look at, the people that are least favored in the community, and those people doing life sentences. They have the most heinous crimes, let's face it, murders and kidnaps and so forth. But those particular men and women, when they've done their time and have programmed, as Mr. Corcoran has talked about, actually are the least likely to reoffend. And I have the department's own statistics on that with me, which show that a recidivism rate for murderers in the state is 20%. Now, we're talking about a percentage of parole violations and all other kinds of recidivism, something over 60%. Yet we don't want to let these 10,000 eligible lifers get anywhere near the front door because of their political unpopularity. That came about with Governor Dukakis's campaign years ago, where they had that revolving door picture. I think you remember that. He let somebody out who went out.
Billy Horton.
Billy Horton, thank you. Committed a heinous crime. And no one's forgotten that, including the failed presidential candidate and every other candidate after him who didn't want that on his name. So instead, we put our governor in charge of reviewing all the parole, and he rejects 90% of the paroles that are granted, which are only 2 or 3% of all the cases that are heard. What's wrong with this picture? It's politically driven. We're spending money keeping, I wouldn't say that every one of those 10,000 lifers should be released, but if you allow the fact that those who did program were recognized for it and were permitted to parole, you would have a whole bunch more people falling into line. And that's that hope, that's that incentive. And if you put on top of that my plan that the people in charge of their well-being are being paid an incentive for their succeeding, then I think you've got a win-win situation, which will drive the costs down. But you could cut the costs today by not having any technical parole violations and by reviewing those people that you're politically holding in those prison cells today for the worst crimes on the grounds that you don't like them, which is understandable, but ignoring the fact that their recidivism rate, their danger to society,
Well, I just wanted to clarify, there's not 40,000 people in prison for purely technical violations. At any given time, there's around 20,000 people in prison that have been revoked. Their parole has been revoked, so they've been returned to custody for revocation. Most of those have actually committed some sort of crime, and the system allows us to revoke them and bring them back to prison without sending them to a new trial with all the costs associated with that. If you look at the actual numbers of people in prison that are there just purely for a technical violation, and some of these technical violations you need to know include things like absconding from parole supervision, so disappearing and not letting their parole agent know where they're at, having a firearm as a parolee, things like that that lead to serious crimes. But the number that have purely a technical violation is somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 at any given time. So it's not 40,000. It's not an insignificant number, but it's still an issue that we recognize is something that needs to be addressed. But if you also put in context for the remainder of those people, you can only be revoked for up to 1 year. If those people were to go to court and be sentenced for those crimes, you wouldn't see a reduction in population. You'd see a significant increase in population because they'd come back for 4 years instead of for 4 months. So those are important things to think about when we're talking about parole and just to keep in context.
Well, LAO dynamic duo, are there some things we could do here?
I was just going to say, I mean, if they're in prison on a technical violation, they actually could not be prosecuted.
Well, for those people, I'm talking about the other section, because there's about 18 to 20,000 that have been returned to custody at any given time. So outside of that, there's 14,000 that have committed another crime, that those people could be returned. If you eliminated an ability to revoke someone's parole altogether, those people could be returned for a much greater period of time than the 4 months we return someone for a technical violation. So there's you can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. You need to consider all of those things.
But are there some groups that we could perhaps identify
Well,
that might require changes in the law? Because maybe you should talk a little bit about
Yeah.
parole. We're sort of unusual in how we do this in the state of California.
we are. So in California, we have what's called determinate sentencing. So you're sentenced to a term of 25 to life or life with the possibility of parole. You basically serve your time and you're released. So you don't have to go before a parole board. So you're sentenced to, say, 6 years in prison. You can earn credits for good behavior, and that can reduce your sentence by up to half in some cases, not for all inmates. But otherwise, you will be let out in a certain period of time. And then we put everyone on parole. Now that's
Actually, everyone on parole.
right. We put everyone on parole.
Not anymore. Not anymore.
But, well, we still technically have everyone on parole.
Summary.
But what the legislature changed in this past year was in recognition of the fact that the system didn't make a lot of sense, and we had, as Dave was describing, a lot of parolees are being revoked to prison on technical or misdemeanor violations or felony violations, but they only spend 4 months in prison. But it's very expensive to do that, and it doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. You're taking them off the streets for 4 months, and then they're back out. So what the legislature did in the last session was they passed a new policy called summary parole or non-revocable parole. So for certain groups of parolees who have not committed serious or violent crimes and who the department, using a risk assessment tool, evaluate as low or moderate risk to reoffend, they're still technically on parole, but they're not being supervised actively by parole agents, and the Board of Parole Hearings can no longer revoke them. So they can still go back to prison, but they would have to be, if they committed a new crime and go through the courts, not simply they have a dirty drug test or they miss an appointment with a parole agent and then the Board of Parole Hearings.
And this saves us money.
So yes, we did score significant savings in the budget with this because it's going to reduce the churning of parolees for, particularly for technical violations. Now, there could be a cost shift because some of these parolees may end up back in prison through the court system. It's hard to estimate how much that might offset the savings, but the new policy will reduce the prison population. And it also will save money on the parole side because agents are no longer actively supervising this population. Now, what the legislature also did in conjunction with that was reduce the parole agent caseload ratios so that now we're providing more intense supervision of all the other remaining parolees, the more serious and violent ones.
Lance, is this a good idea?
Well, I mean, here's the deal. When cash-strapped governments are allocating taxes, they are reluctant to spend any money on criminals. And so the reality is that, we can talk about this all the live one day, but all it's going to take is one of these guys to create a heinous crime, and everybody's going to say, he should have been locked up. He should have been revoked. And here I am as a parole agent. I've got, on one side, a decent guy. He's committed 5 felonies, whatever. But he's working. And he gives me a dirty test. Then on the other side, I've got an Aryan Brotherhood guy who, when he gets drunk or high, he beats the holy hell out of people. And he gives me a dirty test. Now, they're both technical violations. Now, on one side, I can give him a write-up. I can make him go to counseling if counseling is available. I mean, it really depends on the community, on whether or not there are services available for that man. Now, I can either send him back or not. That's a parolee A. Parolee B, I'm not going to wait for him to kill somebody. Because then what you get is you get, what was her name? J.C. Lee Dugard. You didn't do your job. You could have locked him up 5 times, and you didn't do your job, Department of Corrections. And so you're not going to risk that. So you're going to send him back. 4 months, 6 months, whatever you can. And you know what? And the district attorney of that particular district is going to be happy because they didn't have to prosecute. They didn't have to spend money. And that's reality. I mean, I can't put it any more plainly than that.
But is this failure of political leaders explaining that some risks are going to be there in any society?
Look, we react on anomalies. You know what we have to do in this state, and that's one of the things that CCPO has been pushing for, is a sentencing commission that will actually take a look at our sentencing laws. It says, you know what, instead of reacting by emotion, we need to be reacting by logic. If it's $49,000, when you sentence someone to a 20-year term, that's $1 million decision. A jury needs to know that. Because we need to stop putting away people that we're mad at and put away people that are actually dangerous. John said it best. You know what? Here's the prisons. Here's the Department of Incarceration. Here's the people that are really bad because they're there. They're there. They don't want to change. And here's the people that want to change their life. And give them an opportunity. If you give someone an opportunity for change and they take advantage of that, all power to them. You know what? Tax breaks, whatever. I mean, wage incentives, yes, definitely. Give them an opportunity for change, and you know what? A lot of them will take advantage of it.
So Sentencing Commission, interestingly enough, I have a little Hoover report here which talks about Sentencing Commission, and one of the models for what it should be modeled after is the University of California Board of Regents. Thought you'd enjoy that irony. So, Sentencing Commission, good idea? LAO.
Well, actually, the legislature came close to passing a law implementing the Sentencing Commission in the last session. It didn't make it into the final version of the bill. But I think the concern is, our penal code has gotten very complex. There have been a lot of penalty enhancements over the years that have been done sort of piecemeal. And so the idea with the Sentencing Commission would be sort of to take a bigger look at the whole picture and try to figure out if there are changes to be made. There's a lot of, I think, concern about, well, who's going to be on the commission and who are they accountable to? Are they, are they going to be, sort of this unelected body not accountable to the people, and who's going to be appointed and who gets to appoint them? And those are some of the concerns, I think.
Issues like that have been raised about the regents as well at the University of California, just so you know. So, Dave or John, Sentencing Commission, good idea?
Well,
that takes some heat off politically?
The governor did propose Sentencing Commission as part of his second May revise last year. It was part of the package that we had thrown out there that was agreeable. But I think that having also been on ledge staff and seen it from that side, I think there is a real reluctance by some people to turn over that power to an appointed body that isn't accountable to the people. So there's two sides that I can see to that. I do think, though, that in this state, maybe more so than other states, sentencing has become such a political issue that oftentimes the policy isn't well considered, and instead it's what's driving, as opposed to real analytical work. And I think that in order to return some rationality to the system, you have to bring analytical factors back into the equation that often aren't considered. Instead, they're just become...
And a Sentencing Commission might be able to do that with the proper structure.
Yes.
And John, would that take some political heat off the elected representatives and solve your Willie Horton problem?
It would solve that Willie Horton problem. I would include in that undoing what the people did in a vote where they put the governor in charge of the person reviewing all the rules. Because the governor, our current governor, God bless him, a great bodybuilder and actor, he is not a particularly skilled person trained in knowing about what causes people to parole or violate parole. He's appointed people who are. And those people make a decision. Reversing 90% of those decisions just doesn't make any good sense economically. And it's all done by politics.
Let's go on to another policy proposal that's been made. Make certain offenses ineligible for state prison, shifting the burden to counties. That's related to what we've been talking about. Is that a good idea? Is that going to solve some problems? Let's start with the LAO and then go to reactions.
Yeah, this is an idea that we've had, the administration has had. It's been debated, I think, the past 3 or 4 years in a row. And the idea would be to make certain crimes that are currently eligible for prison only punishable by county jail. Now, if you do that, the maximum that you can sentence someone to county jail is 1 year. But we do know that there are, a group of offenders in state prison who are only sentenced to sometimes 16 months is the minimum. And as I mentioned before, inmates can earn credits. So there's a group of inmates, particularly who have committed relatively less serious drug and property crimes, who are only spending, say, 18 months on average in state prison. So when we look at it, the trade-off is, well, currently they're spending 18 months in state prison. If you change state law, they could spend up to a year in county jail, which is less expensive than state prison and would alleviate some of the overcrowding problems in the state prisons. Now, obviously that puts pressure on the counties, and county jails are overcrowded. However, county jails, when they get to sort of a maximum capacity, they actually release certain offenders earlier. So really what would happen is you'd have this shift down to the counties, and then they'd sort of respond by releasing even less serious offenders, probably misdemeanors or people who have committed less serious felonies even earlier. So it's sort of trickle down that way.
Are there any other good reasons to have people in county jails versus the prisons?
Well, county jail,
Correctional facilities.
I guess one benefit, you're kept closer to your community, so in terms of visiting and with your family and stuff for reintegration, you're not shipped off to some prison in the Central Valley, which might be hundreds of miles from where you're from. However, county jails don't really have a lot of rehabilitation programs, but as we've been discussing, state prison rehabilitation programs have been cut pretty drastically too. So for this particular population, it might not make a large difference.
Any other comments on this, John?
I think that it would have an unfortunate tendency to increase recidivism, because to the extent that when these men and women are placed in county jails, they have no programs whatsoever that they can work with, then they're basically staring at each other, getting in each other's face, to put it in the context of being in prison. And if they haven't got anything good to do, they'll think of something less good to do, less than good to do. And they'll wind up either committing a crime, getting into a fight, or at the very least coming out more damaged than when they went in from a social point of view. And this is where I'm saying we need to rethink how we deal with people who come out of prison. They need to have someone who cares for them, not someone who wants to just put them back into the prison.
John is absolutely right. Of the 58 counties in California, 32 are under population controls. One in, one out. In 2006, the California State Sheriff's Association issued a report, 330,000 people who were sentenced to jail spent little or no time in jail. And the reality is that all they're doing is they're a stop, they're a place mark for prison before they're going to prison. And the thought that the counties can handle this is either naivete or absolute ignorance as to what the crisis is. The reality is that no, the counties cannot handle them. If they could, they'd keep them now.
Okay, how about privatization?
Love it.
We know the private market solves all problems, so why can't we just do that for criminal justice? Now, there is a study by the Bureau of Justice Assistance in 2001 that found that in contrast to 20% projected savings, privatizing prisons might lead to only about a 1% saving. Thoughts? Expand?
Well, I think that it is generally known that the prisons, including the ones that are out of state, that California has currently sent 8,000 prisoners to presently, and it's authorized to send 10,500 outside of the state to, that those prisons are located in areas with very low labor rates. And the prison correctional officers, I'll say it right, in those other states, in the private prisons, Corrections Corporation of America and so forth, are paid 1/2 to 1/3 of the salaries that are paid to the men and women in uniform in California. On that kind of a basis, obviously we can save money. That's as to the question of the costs. But you still have the question.
Sorry, it was Johnny Cash.
I'm sorry, John.
I'm turning it off. I'm turning it off.
I gave a talk at Sonoma State recently, and they played that as the opening. In my honor. The cost factors are definitely in favor of doing that. Ultimately, that may be a way of saving dollars, and that's what we're here to talk about. But those particular prisons, since I am on the billing here as having been a writer for Prison Legal News, that's a magazine that covers prison issues all throughout the country, and I've had the opportunity to write and read about cases in the private prisons where the quality of life for the prisoners is even lower by a whole bunch than it is in California. And this in turn leads to my concern, which is a net deficit in humanity. That is, the people come back worse than they went out.
Right.
You haven't corrected anything, you've in fact enhanced it. And while it may be a financial success, it doesn't solve the underlying problem that we need to take care of the people who are in our community that we want not to go back to prison. I'd like to just refer to one model briefly here. In the state of Kansas, they had a model parole program where they did mentor people. And they claim that, according to this article from the Kansas City Star, in April 2010, the recidivism rate had been down to 2%. Now, there's something horribly wrong with what we're doing. If their rate could get down to 2%, and our rate is something north of 60%. And that rate of recidivism has to do with, as Mr. Lewis points out, not just those who are technically returned, but those who return for committing new crimes. I would suggest that they take the people who are in prison today and bottle test them for substance abuse every other day. And when they find out who's using, and they isolate those people, work with them on their substance abuse problem, and find out who's bringing the stuff in, and can those people permanently and take away their pensions or whatever you have to do, but make it really uncomfortable for people who are bringing the drugs into prison. Because I can tell you, I've watched drugs being handed from staff to prisoners and cash being handed back, and there's a whole bunch of people in prison that are high on drugs because it's readily available. Drugs account for 80%. There's a correlation of 80% between drugs and crimes, whether it's in the use of drugs, the sale of drugs, killing someone because they didn't pay their bill for the drugs. There is a high correlation, and I believe that if we worked on isolating that rather than providing an environment where it is permitted to some degree, and I can tell you the degree isn't zero, I think we would be money ahead again. We need to work on that. That's a problem to work with the men and women inside and stop the chemical abuse that is corollary to their criminality.
Dave, is this a big problem? Sounds like we should be worried.
Is drugs in prison a big problem? Yeah, it is a big problem. I think it contributes to a lot of our the use of ADSEG or administrative segregation beds. It contributes to our use of security housing unit beds. It prevents effective rehabilitation, and we do as much as we can address it. It's not an issue that we stand on the sidelines and don't look at, and we constantly are trying to address drugs. But the fact is that there's limited ways that we can really do without, changing people's constitutional rights. And I think that there's always going to be some level of drug abuse that exists in prison. If it's not drugs, it would be Pruno. I mean, there's almost unlimited ways for people that are going to want to get high to try and do it, and they'll do it.
Yeah, but Lance, you said prison guards get paid pretty well. Are prison guards the source of these drugs?
In California, unfortunately, they're, again, representing 34,000 people. I've been going to the academy for 15 years. And I always ask the question, anybody here on career day, did you write down that your lifelong dream was to be a prison guard? And I never get one hand. I get, 500 cadets. I said, how many people are here for the pay and the benefits? And I get 499, 500 hands. I said, does anyone here think it's okay to bring drugs into prison? I don't get one hand. Does anyone here think it's okay to have sex with convicts? I don't get one hand. But I'll be damned if, not sitting on the disciplinary committee, I don't get those cases all the frickin' time. We just had a guy popped for bringing 12 cell phones taped to his body. And he was selling them. $1,000 a cell phone. They're idiots. Every profession has its moron factor. Corrections is no different. And if I just had 1%, like I said, 340 people, I'd be happy. But the reality is no, that's not true. We have our idiot morons who do the wrong thing, whether it be use of force, contraband, sexual relations. It happens. And it makes us all look bad. Matter of fact, I was watching, they had this show on the penitentiary or something on History Channel. And there was this guy. He was a correctional officer from Pennsylvania, worked at some female correctional facility. And he said, yeah, you know, these women, they had hard lives, you know. So, you know, I would, you know, kiss them and tell them they look pretty and have sex with them. I was trying to pick them up. All right? That's what, I mean, people think that's my profession. I'm like, he's a moron, all right? I mean, absolute moron. And unfortunately, those are the stories that get out. People only paid attention to prisons when three things happen: riots, escapes, or allegations of salacious conduct. Those are the only three times. Oh, and money.
So, okay, I keep hearing that it's maybe not going to be easy to reduce costs, although it would be nice to think there's some more things we could maybe do. But how about releasing state prisoners early? I mean, it's going to get to the point. We've got $20 billion problem here. In fact, we're doing that at the UCs, by the way, and the CSUs. We're turning away students. So releasing prisoners early, it seems to me, is sort of the similar kind of thing. Are we going to do that? Should we do that? Are there ways to do that maybe that would make some sense? Obviously, we got the Willie Horton problem, but are there ways to do it? Maybe through allowing additional credits for good behavior, or through blanket release policy, or something. Can we do a better job of at least figuring out who to release?
I would attack the problem by beginning with drug testing. I would drug test. I know what goes on inside the walls. I've watched it. And if you drug test the guys and the women who are in there, and find out who's using and who isn't, you will find a class of people that you have a very much lower risk in the community of releasing. And you should look at those people as your early basis.
Dave, how about that?
Well, I think that, you know, over the last couple of years as we've been in this crisis mode, that the department and the administration have proposed several strategies that would, some of them early release. At one point we proposed a 20-month early release program. But once again, you get back to political will of doing something like that and the risk factor. Essentially what we're in is a risk business. Every decision that gets made in the department, from release to, as Mr. Corcoran was pointing out, revoking an inmate if you're a parole agent, all of those things are about risk. And we've begun to try and identify risk as a factor for non-revocable parole, for example. So people that are low and moderate risk are the people that are on non-revocable parole. But unfortunately, one of them will do something bad. One of them is going to go out and kill someone. It's going to happen. And everybody knows it is. And can the system at that point withstand that kind of action is kind of the question that we always face as professionals in the department, because oftentimes when those kinds of risk factors become so political that it just can't withstand it. And it's also important to know that part of the problem here is we're sitting here, we're talking about the Department of Corrections. The Department of Corrections is the very end of a very long system. And if you don't look at all the factors in the system from the very moment that that first crime is committed, even before then, what happens to people that population that begins to act out when they're in middle school or high school, and you don't begin to address all of those factors, fixing the back end is going to do very little to address your real problems. And the department is committed to working with our stakeholders and our partners in local law enforcement to try and address those things. But ultimately, you have to look at the whole system, because if you're only looking at the people that are in corrections, let's be honest, these people, they're not some guy who got caught smoking a joint somewhere. They've had multiple contacts with the system. They've been on probation. They've been in local jail. And people, finally, by the time that drug offender that everybody talks about gets to us, he's had so many contacts with the system and made no change that there's very little hope that we're going to be that successful in changing him at that point. So all of those things are important factors that you have to think about. It's not as simple as just saying, let's let one person go, because that person has shown himself to not be able to survive effectively. And you really do have to take all those things into account when you're having these kinds of discussions.
I'd like to open it up to the audience at this point, but the ground rules are this. The questions have to be short or I will interrupt you and stop you, and they have to be a question. And I really will stop you if it starts seeming to be a statement. And further, it would be great if you could direct it to particular people, or you could also just direct it to the panel in general. Steve.
So I'd like a comment on
Speak loud, too.
So one suggestion that's been made is you take 700 people who are on death row and you commute their sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So they're never going to get out. That would save $200 million a year or $1 billion over 5 years. A lot of the money that's spent on them now is spent for lawyers doing appeals, which takes 20 years. We know as a matter of statistics that these people are not going to be executed. They're going to die from old age, even under the prison system. So what about that as a way of saving $200 million a year? The governor could do that.
It's not $200 million in corrections. That's an important point to point out. The whole entire budget for all of San Quentin, which is where our condemned inmates are housed, is around a little over $200 million, and that's just a small portion of that population.
A lot of that money goes to lawyers.
Right, but that's
20
not
years worth of appeals.
correct. But that's not a corrections cost, and that's
Is it a state cost?
There's a large. We do fund habeas corpus appeals. We fund a lot of those people, those inmates have representation that is paid for by the state, and it does clog up the court system to some degree, all of the appeals. But to say that there's a $200 million savings in corrections from that would not be accurate.
But it's budgetary savings. It's true. If that's true. Way in the back there, please. Yes, sir.
Yes. Just a question. To address the problem of trying to fix it at the back end and looking at the whole system, I think this is a really important sort of way to think about this problem, because it's not a problem just of releasing people, because when you release them, what do you release them to? And in fact, why are they entering in the system in the first place? A lot of us are in graduate school. For young gangsters coming up, going to prison is like going to grad school. You know, it's a way to come up. So how would, I'm interested in ideas of thinking about integrating not just the tail end of the problem, but also going into communities that are actually prison feeders, urban or suburban prison feeders. How can, what are any suggestions, this idea of multiple modalities of care or assigning responsibility? It certainly starts very young, and some kids are just streamlined early on, really early on, junior high, to head towards prison, and a lot of it is stress, a lot of these other things. So where could, what are some suggestions for looking at prison feeder communities in relation to?
40% of our inmate population comes out of the LA. And the reality is this. You cannot give someone an education, nor can you give someone corrections or rehabilitation or habilitation. They have to want it. And if they don't, there's not a lot you can do. One of the things that I've seen in my life, in my time on the tier, was the best rehabilitator
was time, age. You get to a point you don't want to fight anymore. You don't want it anymore. You want to be home with your children, with your wife, and you want to make a change in your life. And that's not something that you can force on anybody. I mean, I hate to admit it, I'm a smoker. You can't force me to quit smoking. I'll cheat. I'm telling you right now, I'll sneak out back and I'll have a smoke. It's only when I want to quit that I've been successful. And that's the reality with criminogenic behavior as well. It's only when they make a determination to make a change in their lives. And you know, you can provide positive influence. And you know what, it's one of the things my organization believes in. We reach out to communities, to our inmate feeders, and try to make positive. We do over $100,000 in scholarships every year. Trying to reach out to those communities. But it's only when someone wants to make a change that they're going to affect that change. And unfortunately, and this is the misnomer, California, 466 people for every 100,000 go to prison. National average is about 430. The lowest in the nation is Minnesota, about 220 for every 100,000. The highest, well, Texas is bad, 760 for every 100,000. But the highest, District of Columbia, 1,920 people for every 100,000 go to prison. So the reality is this, is that we're not off the mark. Unfortunately, we have an enormous population. And so that generates our prison population. And I don't see it changing. The reality is that we could build a new prison every year and still not keep up. Every year.
I just want to comment on this idea of investing in the community. There is an organization called Justice Reinvestment Group, and they're run by the National Council of State Governments. What they do is they work with states who are interested in doing just what you say, investing in programming in the community, maybe not as early as you really need to start, which would be like elementary school, doing that kind of thing. But they're investing in programs such as substance abuse treatment, job training programs. In those communities, what they do is they identify where the prison population is coming in, where they use GIS mapping to actually isolate those neighborhoods, and then that's where they concentrate resources in upfront investment. They're able to then, once they get the ball rolling, and sort of cut these people off from going to prison, keep them in community, and then there's savings on the correction side because you don't have to then incarcerate these people, and then you can reinvest that money again into building more infrastructure in the community. So it's a model I think that's being used more right now. Texas is doing it. I think Washington State, Michigan is doing it. There are a number of states. You can check out the website called the Justice Reinvestment.
Justice Reinvestment.
Yes.
Okay, just briefly.
Yeah, just briefly, it's important to remember that probation is the entity that's supposed to deal with people when they're first in that first kind of interaction. And probation in this state is really woefully inadequately funded as far as trying to address some of the things that they're faced with. As far as the department itself, we're beginning to work with some of our partners in local law enforcement, such as San Diego. We proposed a diversion program in San Diego to try and reach some of the offenders that may be amenable to treatment and keep them out of prison that are parole violators. But generally, as a department, we don't see someone until they've already committed all of those acts. And it's really, it's very difficult for us to make that change until they've kind of aged out of the whole thing, as Mr. Corcoran pointed out.
I'd like to do is collect 3 questions. So Rob, and then there was somebody over there too. Okay, Rob, start.
Okay. The growth in the prison population in California is not just a direct reflection of the growth in the crime rate, but rather a policy decision that's been made about the length of prison sentences, and it's getting increase in the length of sentences. And something that we haven't heard about is the role of the California Correctional Peace Officers Association and its political action committees in lobbying with respect to the sentencing policies. And I'm wondering if plans on that issue.
We've only supported one sentencing enhancement. Generally, we stay out of those policy decisions, and that was our support of 3 strikes. And we did so at the behest of Crime Victims United, the Florida State Crime Victims Bureau, and to be quite honest with you, our own observation of the revolving door. And I know that there are anomalies. I know that there is the pizza guy who actually is out. He got out. And, you know, I mean, there are those situations. Unfortunately, what happens, and I've attended, unfortunately, an execution. J. Sirpons was convicted of murdering 2 shopkeepers in the commission of a robbery. He's been executed. Manny Babbitt was actually the execution that I attended, and he murdered a 78-year-old woman and later claimed that it was a Vietnam flashback. He got the Purple Heart on death row. And I was there. It's an experience I never want to go through again. And I can tell you that there are men at California State Prison, Sacramento, and Salinas Valley State Prison, Pelican Bay, who've done far more heinous crimes. So when I hear about the death penalty, when I hear about 3 strikes or any of these things, unfortunately, what's thrown in our face are those anomalies. You never hear about Larry Babbitt.
Okay, but let's talk. Rob actually is an expert on statistical analysis of these kinds of things. What did the statistical data tell us? Do you know with respect to whether 3 strikes has been a tremendous success, has reduced crime?
Come on.
Are there other policies?
Let's play the numbers.
Better?
So, I mean, I've been a policy lover in this state for the past 40 years has been the severity of sentencing. And the evidence is overwhelming that...
It depends on who you talk to.
No. I mean...
I'm in Berkeley. I know who I'm talking to.
Okay, so, what we know is that the diminishing margin of returns each additional year of sentencing, and that most of the sentencing, and that most of the big incapacitation bang for the buck, we're already well past that marginal point, and that was a political decision. Now, it's not that this has been thrust on us by accident of increasing crime rate. We've made different decisions in other states, and this is the second time I've asked you this question in public settings, and I still feel like I haven't really gotten to
We agree.
What I know are the facts about
We agree.
About your political.
We agree. We agree that 3 strikes needs modification. Okay, it doesn't need to be 32 pages. The original 3 strikes law was 3 pages. It was very simple. But no. Unfortunately, and what I was getting to in my death penalty argument is it's not necessarily the law. It's the application of the law. And if you're sentenced in Bakersfield, you're going to get a far, in Kern County, you're going to get a far more severe sentence than you are in Marin. And that's wrong.
There is a place where I believe a retrospective cut could be made in this regard. Numbers either, Mr. Lewis could probably correct me on this, it's either in the 4,000s range or the 7,000s range of the number of prisoners in California on 3 strike sentences whose 3rd strike was not a serious or violent crime. That is, it was, for example, a common one is a petty theft with a prior commission, which means and I've talked to a couple of guys in the cell block who were there for stealing a couple of AA batteries or boosting some DVDs. And this just seems like a total waste. If you're looking for a place in the legislature to make some room and cut the population, these are men and women who are serving 25 years at $49,000 a year, plus as they get older for their medical costs that you now want to try and cut in half. Good luck. they're still going to get older. They're going to have these emergencies. And I believe that there's a huge potential savings to be made by saying that the state does not need, for protection of public safety, to incarcerate people for 25 years to life for a third offense, which was a minor offense.
Well, especially if Lance is right, and I think the data are pretty clear on this, is that as you get older, you become less and less inclined to be engaged in criminal activity. So you wouldn't do double A, you do single A or something like that. Okay, yes, back there.
So it seems to me that reducing the prison population wouldn't necessarily save us money on staffing, since the staff to inmate ratio is already out of whack. And so is it true then that reducing the prison population would save money mostly in medical costs? And if that's the case, then I wonder how much we need to reduce the prison population in order to really wind spending down.
Well, I think that's the answer is Paul. And I'll let Paul speak to the aspect of reducing the overall prison cost. But in terms of healthcare, you do get some reduction in costs from reducing the inmate population. I think the problem is that the folks who are really driving our healthcare costs are the high flyers, as we call them, the folks who are typically elderly people and that consume a disproportionate amount of healthcare. Just like it works in the regular community, there's a small portion of people who drive most of the costs. And those tend to be in the prison system, the folks who are in there on life sentences, on very long sentences for very serious crimes. And so when we talk about proposals to reduce the prison population, what we're usually talking about is the lower end offender, and not these sort of these people who have committed very serious crimes. And those are the very folks that you need to pull out of the system to get real savings in healthcare.
So let's go here, here, and let's get 3 questions at once. Start there, and then go there, and then over there.
So given the admitted nexus between drug crimes and incarceration, do the Correctional Peace Officers Association, what's their view on decriminalization of things like marijuana, which are increasingly supported politically, and will be on the ballot as an initiative? And then in lieu of that, what is there a political dynamic whereby that organization and that constituency could support something like decriminalization? And the final part is, Lance, we would invite you to come teach us how to lobby this afternoon as students, because we're very impressed by the influence there.
Wonderful. Let's just wait a minute. I want to get 3 questions out here, and then we're going to come to answers. Okay. So you do your question. I'm just going to collect them and do the great ones. Okay, yeah.
How about the desegregation of prison populations? Are there any implications cost-wise in that policy?
And here you mean different levels of the different levels.
No, I'm talking about desegregation on ethnic lines within the prisons. Do those have cost implications?
Okay, so we got that one. And then the final question over here.
Yeah. Concerned with the older prisoners who are less likely to be recidivists, who, and I don't know what the numbers are, but I know there are those who are comatose, who are being guarded in a very high-cost facility. And my question is, are there people in that category who, if we must continue to imprison them, can we imprison them in community nursing homes, which would cost a lot less money and, again, reduce the overall population? I'm saying that the only way you really save money is to close a wing of a building or a physical piece. You don't reduce it by taking 5% out of that building. You've got to close the building, close half the building. So I'm wondering if you've got people there who, except for our need for vengeance, were unnecessarily keeping in the prison system, who are not a threat, physically incapable of being a threat.
Okay, so we have 3 questions. One was on the marijuana question, one was the desegregation question, the third one was the older prisoners who are ill. What can we do with them? Somebody pick one and take it.
Well, I can speak to the elderly inmate issue. I think you're absolutely right. There are a lot of folks who don't pose a threat to public safety that are in there because just because their crimes are so serious, it's very politically risky to go ahead and pass a policy that would let them out. Right now, Senator Leno just introduced a bill to institute medical parole. And basically what that would do is it would allow inmates who are permanently incapacitated, and we're talking about most extreme cases here, probably people who are quadriplegics, who are on their deathbed, who literally can't get up to even throw a punch at someone, you know. So that proposal is out there right now. And there are potential savings there. I think we could be talking perhaps in the low tens of millions, just from a few people. I mean, maybe a few dozen people we can get that kind of savings just because they're so expensive. The problem there, I think, is in the implementation. There's a big problem with implementation. There's about 15 states that have tried to do something similar to this, and what they find is they don't achieve the savings that are envisioned because of this risk and reward structure that exists for the department in terms of actually letting people out. Even if they have authority, the Secretary of Corrections or the Board of Parole Hearings has to make a decision to let someone out. And it's politically risky because, again, these are people with serious crimes, and it's not, there will be a lot of people making a lot of noise about this. And so you actually need to have the willpower to implement it after it's been passed to achieve those savings.
So Dave, what do we think of this, and also the desegregation question?
Well, medical parole, it was proposed by the receiver as a solution to achieve their $800 million. And there are a large number of, well, not large, it's relatively small, but there's a number of inmates that cost us a relatively large amount of money because of their condition and maybe don't have the risk. But I mean, the reality that we face is there's already a system in place where you can do compassionate release, but it requires that you take it back to the judge. And oftentimes when those things happen, the judge won't let that happen. I mean, like I said, our system is a risk and reward system. It's very much risk-based, and people are and that includes political risk, not just the risk of new crimes. It's the political risk that people face. And I think that that has driven a large amount of the decision-making that happens in the state, and the political riskiness of something like that, and something bad happening. And it may not be what you think. It may not be that this inmate suddenly gets well, hops out of bed, and goes kill someone. It may be that someone goes and finds him and kills him. That's the risk that you find in this case. So I think it's a decision that ultimately will be made by politicians. I mean, politicians are always weighing political risk when they make those decisions. So I think the department thinks that there's probably a lot of merit to the proposal, but it's not up to us to
what about desegregation?
Desegregation. We have a lawsuit that we lost that requires us to desegregate our prisons. Largely, we've traditionally segregated on racial lines. Largely due to the gang problems that exist in our prisons, which are largely, the gangs largely are aligned along racial lines. The Aryan Brotherhoods, Southern Hispanics, Northern Hispanics, even regional affiliations like the Fresno Bulldogs. Those issues don't go away just because you can no longer segregate someone in a cell based on race. And so what we face is a difficulty in addressing the issues that come from putting someone together, that their gang affiliation, and most people in prison have to join some sort of gang for protection reasons, and those can cause problems. I think that most states that have done some sort of desegregation will see an increase in the use of ADSEG, administrative segregation, which is where you separate someone because of disciplinary reasons. Ultimately, we're working on it, and we try to do it very slowly and thoughtfully so that we ensure that there are the least number of incidents possible, that we don't endanger inmates or especially staff, because a lot of times issues happen to staff, and those are often gang motivated as well. So,
Lance,
I could, yeah. Just on drugs, let me tell you right now, we have not taken a position on medical marijuana or marijuana legalization, and I hope to God they legalize it. I mean, I would love that on a personal level. I'm telling you right now. All right. On desegregation, I was the only guy in the state who filed a grievance when they forced desegregation a number of years ago. They forced rival gangs onto the same yard, and then they later accused us as officers of setting up gladiator fights. And it was a high-profile case in the 90s, really, really awful. And the reality is that we don't segregate. The inmates themselves pick and choose. And by forcing them together, it creates enormous problems for us. And you know, like I said, honor prisons, where you sign an affirmament, when you put your name on the dotted line, you say, I will obey by certain rules, and I will live with people of different color, that's a different story. But when you're talking about a level 4 institution, when you've got some bad people, and you're forcing them together, not a bad, that's a bad situation. That's a setup for staff, that's a setup for the department, and it's a setup for failure. With respect to the issue of compassionate release, it's there now, and you use the word vengeance. There's also the word justice. Okay? And just because you ended up being a paraplegic because you shot somebody, a wife, a child, and in return, you were also shot, there is the notion that you're going to pay for that crime. And so all of these decisions have to be weighed very, very carefully. And you know, I've been around the system for a long time. And in 1995, Bill Lockyer was the Senator Pro Tem, and he proposed early release. And what happened is they began to drill down on the individual cases. Nobody wanted to put their signature on anybody getting early release. They were that afraid. We don't get people by accident.
John, I'd like to add a little insight into the subject of the forced integration. That's a somewhat overstated position. What happened was an inmate sued successfully. He was an African-American inmate. He was unhappy that every time he was transferred to another institution, which in his case was quite frequent, he was required for his first 60 days of check-in to be housed with another African-American inmate as a matter of course. He had no choice. And he claimed that that was a violation of his constitutional rights. The suit does not require that therefore the Department of Corrections force everybody to live with someone that they don't want to live with. In other words, the reverse of the case that was faced by this particular inmate is not what faces most of the other inmates. And in the prisons that I was in, we were allowed to pick and choose who we wanted to live with. In some cases, if you lived with someone of a different race, a third party might object to that and give you some heat. There was a political community that you had to learn to live within. But as far as the department being required to force you to live with someone of a random choice and you have no out, that is not the conclusion of that court decision.
More questions? Okay, so let's let this be the last question.
I know that New York State in recent years made changes, a number of changes that help the state decrease their prison population, their corrections population, and also decrease costs. And I'm wondering, this question, I guess we'll start with the LAO folks, to what extent California is looking to New York State as a model, and what certain elements that New York pursued can be applied here in California.
Well, in general, you know, in Sacramento, when people are looking for ideas, we definitely do look at other states. I'm not personally familiar with what New York has done to decrease their prison population. I don't know if you know specifically what they do.
I believe that they took on a number of sentencing reforms, but I don't know the specifics. I'm hoping maybe there, but
yeah, I personally don't know what New York has done.
Well, I guess we can open it up to other states as well then. I mean, it doesn't have to be New York State, just other states that we can use as models here.
Yeah, in my introduction I mentioned the new probation and central funding program that we passed, and that was actually modeled off of what was done in Arizona the prior year. So, you know, to answer your question, we are generally trying to look for other states, and there's clearinghouses of information like the Pew Center for the States and the National Conference of State Legislatures that policymakers in the legislature turn to see what other states are doing.
One thing is they did change their drug laws. And the other thing is New York has over 70 correctional facilities. Texas has 110. We have 34. And our population is greater than all of them. Actually, if you combine New York at this point with 60,000 and declining, and Texas at 160, we're close to the total population and 34 institutions. One of the things that we've suggested as a union is smaller, more specialized facilities that deal only with drug treatment, only with anger management, that are specialized, and that are honor prisons, and that we have, just as John suggested, we have a place for the bad guys, and then we have the guys that we're mad at. We want to change and give them an opportunity. So that is a difference between our system and a number of other systems.
And that's true. Our system has very, very large prisons that make it somewhat difficult to provide programming opportunities. And those prisons are packed to the gills and weren't really designed to house necessarily the number of inmates that are in there, which makes some of those options difficult under the overcrowding conditions that exist. And so that's part of the reason why in AB 900, for example, there was reentry centers, which are smaller, community-based sort of prisons to address those issues as they come out. But I mentioned earlier briefly that we are working with some of our stakeholders, for example, San Diego County, to institute kind of a parole diversion program. And those are largely informed by similar programs that exist in other states. And I think that we really need to look at outside ourselves for where there are successes and try to model on those successes.
And with all due respect to Mr. Lewis, AB 900 provided $7 billion for building prisons and $50 million for rehabilitation. That's less than $30 per inmate per year. So the reality is AB 900 did nothing with respect to the success of the Department of Corrections.
Karen, I'm going to let you ask me. We should end on.
I think this might be a good summary question. So let's say you were a group of grad students who had just heard some really interesting, fascinating ideas, and there are some panelists who are experts in certain domains of the realm of criminal justice, and everybody's mentioned politics. So I'm just wondering if you could tell the public or tell people who are interested in making a change in the system, where would you tell them to go? What would you tell them to do? What should we tell people who we know who are interested in making a change?
I think there's lots of information out there. The department on its website has lots of information about the offenders that we house. I think that it's important for people to understand exactly who is in the Department of Corrections, and for that matter, who is not. Because I think oftentimes people think, oh, that's just, there's a lot of low-level offenders that haven't done serious crimes. There's a lot of information out there that could help dispel some of those myths and rumors that exist. And I think it's important that people educate themselves on the whole system as well. What is probation in this state? What is the state of the county jails? Because it's a system. Without a systemic approach, you're really not going to address these issues. And the more people become informed and educated about the issues, maybe the politics and the sound bites become less important, and the actual policy and the actual decision-making become much more important.
I would also say if you really want your voice to be heard, one way to do it is, it's not that far. You can go to Sacramento, go to any of our hearings, our budget hearings for CDCR, where a lot of these proposals are heard, or the policy committee hearings, and they allow, at the end, any member of the public can come up and give their ideas.
The other thing is, and this I'm going to be very brief, you have to give offenders an opportunity to change their life. Now, whether they take advantage of that or not, that's up to them. But if you don't give them anything to look forward to,
that all they're going to do is come back to us. And I'm tired of my profession being labeled a failure, because we do a very good job with what we've got, but we have to give them real opportunity to change their lives.
And John, you get the final word.
I would tell your voters to use their power of enfranchisement to elect people who will honor the obligation to solve the problems of the community without looking for their own political rear ends. And if they don't have the internal fortitude to stand up and say, I will solve problems no matter how many rocks you throw at me, don't vote for them.
Thank you. Let me just say, this was put together by the Criminal Justice Policy Group. And the folks here, members of that group, would you raise your hands if you're here? Thank you. This is one of the policy groups we have here at the Goldman School. And I want to thank this panel, which has been really fabulous. I really thank them for coming here and spending this evening with us and informing us in such a lucid way about these really complicated issues. So again, actually, another round of applause.
Good seeing you.